Hey, it's Stu, and about this time last week, I was midair um, on a flight back from my conference in New York. I read on that flight some of a book that I'm going to talk about today, and I guess I'll just start with some stats. This is going to be a book reflection / review, maybe even a recommendation kind of video. And then I did walk around my neighborhood yesterday, beautiful sunny day, and I distributed books to the little free libraries. And where it was mostly just unhauling, I did haul 2 books. They were cute and they were there, and actually I was really restrained. My neighborhood little free libraries are all stuffed right now. So I overstuffed them and then participated in unstuffing a couple of books. I'm going to talk about that. So, and then I'm going to do maybe just a quick for myself, reorganize what I'll be reading next. In any case, for the stats. Okay, so in this week, I have read 2 fully digital books checked out from the library and listened to 1 audiobook checked out from the library. I had no physical copies from those. And then I read hybrid these 2 books, Bewilderment and The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. And then I read just fully in the physical copy, Anita de Monte Last. So I'm currently in the sort of reading prompt challenge, books with the setting in New York. But you'll see that a couple of these didn't really fit. They were ones that were great crossovers into a couple different reading prompts. So I'll kind of get into it. I'll go through them in the order in which I consumed them. I finished them. I was reading more than one thing / listening to more than one thing at the same time. So, Marjan Kamali's The Lion Women of Tehran. I started on the plane and then I finished after I got over some fatigue from traveling. As I said, it was all digital, so I don't have the physical copy to show. And one day I will get into editing videos. This is not the day. I have a pretty busy life outside of this enormous amount of reading that I'm doing. So The Lion Women of Tehran, it was a great story. I highly recommend anyone that just kind of likes to read a good story. This is, intergenerational or multiple generational friendship. The context is growing up together in Tehran from different backgrounds. And there's some look into what sort of different backgrounds in Tehran. It's definitely historical fiction. Historical fiction light. It doesn't go into a whole lot of the fiction aspect, but, in order to be able to digest the setting of Tehran, and understand the forces and what's happening in these 2 women's lives, you have to know the history. So it's starting in the 60s, I believe, in Tehran, and then moving through like the 90s past the coup and the Shah and the removal of the Shah and all of the things that are happening in Tehran. We have 2 protagonists. Both are likable, and then kind of enter the daughter as well, the daughter of one of the protagonists. I found this book entertaining, and I thought that Marjan Kamali did a great job of kind of just weaving a story together that was followable, even for folks who maybe don't know a whole lot of the background. It was informative, but as I said, light, not necessarily over, like, I just read it on the back of Shark Dialogues, which had a whole lot of history and a whole lot of density in there, and where there's a lot of tragedy in these women's lives. It was also sort of like a bit cozy. I would say that this book certainly has trauma triggers, but it's handled in kind of a cozy way. And I think that the craft of Marjan Kamali isn't superb. I wouldn't guess this like a really high rating for this author's say craft, especially when I'm looking at some other authors that I read, even like Richard Powers and Elif Shafak. But it's definitely a book worth reading. And again, I would recommend it to anyone who is into historical fiction or just likes stories, especially about friendship. The next book that I listened to was Felicia Berliner's Schmutz. I found this book raucous. I found it funny. And I found it taut, I think is the word that I would use. Like, don't read this book the premise of this book is about a young Hasidic girl, 18-year-old Hasidic girl who is going to college and gets a laptop and gets access to internet, even though it's forbidden in her community by the rabbis. There's it kind of flies under the radar because she's going to school. She becomes curious with access to Google and asks questions and ends up asking some questions, some curiosities about sex and or anatomy, and then falls into porn, hence the schmutz, and develops a pretty severe porn addiction. I really liked this character, Razel. And I found that the inner workings of Razel and the complexities of even this fraught discussion about, is sheltering someone effective or not effective? What is belonging or not belonging? Certainly a lot of look into what is the pleasure of women and how is that understood, controlled or not controlled. I found all of that really raw and honest and beautiful and relatable. I didn't particularly like the goth characters, so I guess there's going to be a little bit of spoiler. Razel makes some friends in college, and they're goth, and the one character's name is Sam, mostly, and they become friends, and it's kind of an unlikely friendship. I found the character of Sam kind of like 1990s teen movie stereotypical, and I didn't like Sam. I understand that there was some exploration of this unlikely friendship, but I that was one aspect of the book that I didn't find great. I also, want to do a huge trigger warning for anyone reading this book. Obviously, if you don't like explicit explanations of pornographic sex, then, this is not the book for you. If that doesn't bother you, and or you're willing to push through that to explore exactly what this book is exploring, then for sure, this is the book for you. That being said, there's also what I'm going to describe as a sexual assault scene, and this scene is not described as a sexual assault scene in this book. However, Razel is far too drunk. She's inebriated to consent, and I found the scene very troubling, and I think I just want to make sure that folks know that it's there. And I also wish that the author would have had some introspect of that, or some way to understand that scene as sexual assault, not as coming of age and this is kind of what you get if you're out there drinking and messing around when you're naive. And that's kind of like the vibe that I got off that scene, and I take offense. So it's there. It's part of the book overall. In fact, I think it's even an honest part of the book. I mean, this has happened to many, if not most, women. I just wish that the book could have framed it quite a bit differently. Okay, so then I read Bewilderment by Richard Powers. So I'll back up a little. The Lion Woman of Tehran was kind of finishing up Asian Pacific Islander heritage reading prompt, but it also kind of leaned into the prompt of settings in New York, because it does take place in Tehran and New York. One of the characters moves to New York. Felicia Berliner's Schmutz is Brooklyn and Midtown, and a New York book, for sure, a New York book. Richard Powers' Bewilderment, I decided to read as part of Mental Health Awareness Month, and I didn't quite get it, and I think I read this on June 1st, so it was like whatever, right after, as if that's important. What a beautiful and tragic book. I loved this child. I really respected Richard Powers' exploration of grief. The love between the child and the son it's beautiful, it's precious. It is such an important part of this book that I found really, the reason to read this book. Sort of also those decisions that parents make on how to treat, how to handle their child, their child going out into the world with all of the forces that say that they know more, such as public education, right? That these stances that are taken that other people know more about your child than you do as a parent. And I think that was explored quite well here. And it is maybe the main commentary of the book outside of grief and love that parents have for children. The ending is tragic, and although it tries to leave with hope, I guess that's a bit of a spoiler. I was disturbed by the tragedy of the ending, and absolutely would cautiously, because of that, I would cautiously recommend this to folks who would like to explore any of the things that I just had said. It's not a long read. And I mean, Richard Powers is the craft is there. He's an excellent writer. You really get involved in some of these sentences. He's been criticized. There are some, like, in the speculative parts, which were less interesting to me, or the description of the planets. I mean, that could be really someone's jam. And it wasn't mine. It wasn't what engaged me in the book. I kind of fell out in those moments. I don't begrudge it. It is part of what this book is, but that wasn't the thing for me. And in those parts, I think that there's some kind of cheesy ass metaphors that I could see someone would criticize him for. However, I think that's just kind of looking for criticism, unless you just really have a thing for, like, I don't like cheesy ass metaphors. Anyway, I wasn't too engaged in the discussion of the planets and sort of like that speculative part. I did love the reference to Flowers for Algernon. I loved that book. When I was in middle school, and sort of the multiple references throughout it also created a lot of meaning for me in reading this book. The next book that I finished was The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a super, super hyped book. It even says, over 2 million copies sold. And what I can say is I'm not a romance gal, and this is absolutely commercially viable. So folks who like stories that, kind of read like screenplays, in as much as you definitely could see it into a movie, the way that the characters behave, the way that the plot line is developed. Interestingly enough, this also has to do with sort of like Hollywood, which, isn't my jam either. I appreciated the exploration of how you couldn't be out in Hollywood and what that really meant, and sort of like the assumptions of like the tabloids and how that impacts people who have celebrities' lives. I liked those parts. This is a whole lot of book with almost no character development, and I was interested to see how you could just do this much and not really know anything about the complexity of either of the characters, the woman Monique or Evelyn. So heavily reliant on tropes, as commercially viable literature is. It's easy to read, and I can't hate on books that are easy to read, because people read them, and reading is good. And this also introduces points of view that maybe the readers of the romance genre and or commercially viable books don't get that much of. Maybe that's really a thing to celebrate. Although there's been literature exploring any of the themes in this book for a very long time. So I wouldn't want to give it too high of praise for that. But, the accessibility for sure. plot-driven book. The plot drove me through it. I finished it very, very quickly. It's pacey. And, I can see why people leaned into it. I have like 3 other Taylor Jenkins reads on my shelf. I found them, I think all of them, with the exception of this one. This one I got at a thrift shop. And I'm going to donate it back to the Friends of the Library. I think, I have 3 other ones. I think I'm interested in Malibu Rising, and I think I might just see how that goes and then let the other 2 go, because there's nothing wrong with her. It's just sort of like a couple of other authors that I think I talked about earlier in some videos. They I can see their allure, but they're just, I have a lot to read and they aren't necessarily for me. That being said, Anita de Monte Laughs Last is so similarly premised, right? In as much as the fickleness of high society, the sort of like came from both the protagonists in this are Cuban American, who come from either being orphaned or like no family around, come from meager means, and in both of these, they're grappling with New York, although this one goes back and forth between obviously Hollywood and California and New York. Xochitl González, her craft as a writer is, I'll just say perhaps that's my style, right? It is clearly literary fiction, and there's some sophistication in the way that this story is told. I found this story harder to stay in for that. It wasn't as pacey, but it was so much more compelling. Like, I know these characters, and like the points that this book was trying to make were very well made. Who's remembered, who's forgotten, who's exonerated, who is stereotyped. I found some of the symbolism, although this is not necessarily new, but there's a hair cutting scene that was powerful. It's powerful. Oppressors have cut hair, in many, if not most cases, and without consent, right? I found a lot. Of course, this book is about art, so there's the imagery bestowed and the look at higher education, high society, art, justice. It's really well done. I don't think anyone needs me to recommend this book to them because Reese is doing it for me. But I definitely have folks who I know would really like this book. And definitely, of all of the books I just talked about, this one's kind of standing out as one that I remember and I continue to think about. And I want to kind of page back. Like, if I were keeping books, this would have annotations that I would want to go back and kind of go through. This I recently hauled at the Friends of the Library. It was one of my 2 free books. And I was kind of excited. You don't get like modern releases in the year when you're thrifting very much. So I actually think I'm going to put this in my neighborhood little free library because it's very close and it's really endeared to me. It's not the one I call my favorite, but it's really close and endeared to me. And I think I've got a couple really contemporary books, a couple arcs from there. So I think either the teachers over at that high school or some neighborhood folks would read this book and like this book. Lastly, and not leastly, probably my favorite book of this whole series that I'm talking about was Elif Shafak's There Are Rivers in the Sky. There Are Rivers in the Sky is effectively historical fiction, but it's so multidisciplinary, absolutely looking at contemporary world issues through the stories and the characters, bringing rivers together, history together, who owns history, who owns artifacts. I'm Alicia, like the concept of follow. I was almost disappointed because, when the book's described, it's like it follows a single drop of water or rain across centuries and locations. and at the end, there's actually kind of an outline that does it. And I was like, oh, okay, it does actually do that. And where I find that, like, that framework so compelling, this book absolutely developed his characters, absolutely gave the history and needed without overwhelming. So, that's also my style, right? Some people love, like, all of the historical parts of historical fictions. That's why they're reading. But, like, there's enough context in history. Always read the author's note, the amount of research that Elif Shafak did for this, the amount of sort of, like, what I would call cultural and historical competency that Elif Shafak has. And in addition, her ability to make a book that is accessible, page-turning, has enough plot, but definitely embedded in the theme, the characters, like in juxtaposition to Evelyn Hugo, like the characters are so beautifully developed and relatable, even though they aren't like you or I, or probably most of the readers, right? But the universality of the humanity is there, the confrontation of erasing the history of genocides, of the brutality of historical nations and empires, of and crap. It even looks at sort of like, oh yeah, depression, suicidal ideation, organ harvesting. What would you do for your family? All of that is woven into this in just such a masterful, and again, I'm going to use the word commercially viable, like it's accessible in a way that, say, the last Pamuk I read, wasn't, per se. But yeah, absolutely. This is my favorite book. There are rivers in the sky. And that wrapped up at 6 books. Yep, that wrapped up the reading that I had done in this last week. I am currently about halfway, maybe a little under, maybe a third. It's good. Third. This I'm reading just the physical copy. This is the 9th hour, setting of New York, really looking at the religiosity of these characters within the Irish Catholicism in a very intimate and detail focused way. I really like Alice McDermott's writing style. Because I just came out of Page Turners, this one's a little bit harder for me to get into, but we'll see what I have to say about it at the end of the week when I do that review. And then I started listening to, and it's a decent listen, in Improvement. Improvement is also taking place in New York, and yeah, there's family sort of drama. There's just a lot. There's confronting justice, racism, family drama, self determination, kind of those things. And I'm only on chapter 2 listening. It takes a lot longer to listen to books than it does for me at least, to read them. But that's currently what I'm in. I'm about to start Leave the World Behind, and I expect this weekend that I will finish Leave the World Behind. It's not a long read, and I'm to understand it's a quite compelling read. And then maybe also finish Tuesday Nights in the 1980s by Molly Prentice. I'm to understand that this is a pacey book as well. And I'm kind of interested in thinking about the art scene in New York through this author's lens, and which is also taking place in the 1980s, right? By the way, this is, like, in the case of Elif Shafak, and in the case of this, these fictions are based on, like, historical characters that both authors renamed and sort of reimagined and brought their story to life. But because they are taking a lot of liberty, like, they have to, rename the characters, and they shifting timelines, and but a lot of the context is there. And again, always read author notes. So this is what I have planned for this weekend. And then, next week we'll be continue with these. And then I have, All the Rivers, Never Let Me Go, Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close for the Sitting in New York prompt. That should wrap that up. So I think that'll be what I'm reading next week. Things are coming off hold that aren't related on my Libby shelf. We'll see. I just keep reorganizing everything. My last thoughts are just going to be on these two little books these are the ones I hauled from my neighborhood little free libraries. The Kamongawa Food Detectives. I mean, if this doesn't say little and cozy and cute and short and sweet, and this is what you read, well, waiting for somebody at a bus stop or something. Yes. And then this, Julie Chan is Dead. This is a very modern book. Like, it's also trendy. I expect it to be very pacey, and I anticipate reading the actual physical copy and and sort of consuming it quickly. I hope to get to this outside of reading prompts, but we'll see. I hope to actually get to this one. And this was a decision I made when I hauled it, like before I leave for my summer trip. So that's my intention. If not, it'll sit on my shelf and it'll get read and, and redistributed back into either the Friends of the Library or the Little Free Library system. So yeah, that's it. Another great week being bookish.